It's the 1940s at Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital, a vast mental asylum. These patients are suffering from mental illness, a topic which is severely misunderstood. As a result, one common technique applied to these patients is the lobotomy, which involves severing nerves in their brain. The result is like turning a light out in someone's mind, often leaving them a shell of their former selves in a zombie-like state. It is here at Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital that we meet our story's protagonist, the Sackler family, the family that would go on to create a $14 billion drug empire and play the leading role in starting the opioid crisis. But way before all of that, back in the 1940s, three brothers from the Sackler family were working at Creedmoor. They spent much of their time administering another brutal treatment, electroshock therapy. This involved tying a patient down and sending an electric current through their brain. It often left patients deeply traumatized. After administering this procedure thousands of times, the Sackler brothers became convinced there must be a better way. They believed mental disorders were caused by problems with someone's brain chemistry, and if it was a chemical problem, there must be a chemical solution. In other words, there could be a pill to fix any mental issue. Based on this, the three Sackler brothers bought a small pharmaceutical company named Purdue, and the two younger brothers began working on the business. Meanwhile, the eldest brother, Arthur Sackler, went on an audacious side quest. Arthur bought a medical advertising company and pioneered some shady but revolutionary ideas on how to sell drugs. He hired doctors and used them as salesmen to pitch products to other doctors. He also paid a division head at the FDA to promote his drugs. And he even created ads listing medical professionals that had recommended a certain drug, but in reality, they weren't even real people. He just made them up. Basically, Arthur Sackler crossed all kinds of ethical lines to sell his pharmaceuticals, and in some cases committed outright fraud, but in doing so, he became extremely wealthy. However, Arthur's biggest breakthrough was expanding the market for addictive tranquilizers. Using various shady techniques, he convinced doctors and patients that they needed Valium and Librium for everyday anxiety. Unsurprisingly, widespread abuse and addiction soon followed. But when questioned about the growing problem of addiction, Arthur Sackler had a chilling response. He said, "The drug is not the problem, reckless patients are the problem." Arthur died before the modern-day opioid crisis started, but he created the environment in which it could happen. And with Arthur gone, new members of the Sackler family would take over the company, and they would look for new products to grow their fortune further. And this is where things start to get much more disturbing. Part 2. How the opioid epidemic really started. The Sacklers' first successful pain drug was called MS-Contin. This was morphine with a seal around the pill which caused the chemical to enter the bloodstream slowly and continuously over a period of time. That's where the Contin part of the name comes from. This drug was mostly used in cancer patients, but the Sacklers had a huge problem. Their patent was expiring soon, which meant other companies could produce generic versions of their drug, which would drastically reduce their profit. So, the Sacklers began looking for a new drug to sell. They suggested oxycodone, a very powerful opioid that was addictive and a lot stronger than morphine. But they said, what if we use the same Contin system we created for morphine? So instead of someone getting a big dose of oxycodone, it'll slowly go into the bloodstream over 12 hours. They would call it OxyContin. And it had a similar effect to heroin. The truth was this could be a good drug for end-of-life pain or for a short period after a really serious accident, as in those cases the benefits could outweigh the harm of taking this very strong addictive drug. But unfortunately, the Sacklers had other ideas. They wanted a blockbuster drug that they could sell to as many people as possible. If they only promoted it as an end-of-life drug, that would mean a much smaller market. But what if they could get doctors to prescribe it for common conditions like knee or back pain? If OxyContin was a drug for everyone with any pain, that could make them very rich. Through a set of secret documents, we now know that Purdue deliberately set out to hide the dangers of their drug and instead market it to the widest possible audience using one of the largest pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in history. It would be this decision to put profits over safety that would begin what we call the opioid crisis, taking hundreds of thousands of lives. However, In order to claim that their drug was safe and effective for a wide range of uses, they would need FDA approval. And since the Sacklers didn't have any evidence of this, surely they wouldn't be able to get it approved, right? Well, unfortunately, this is where things start to get more controversial. Part 3, FDA Purdue Pharma achieved something very unusual. They obtained the help of a medical officer at the FDA. His name was Curtis Wright, and he was the medical reviewer in charge of deciding whether to approve OxyContin. And yet he was working closely with Purdue on the wording. At one point, Purdue executives camped out for 3 days in a rented room near Curtis's office, and together they helped draft the FDA review of OxyContin in a way that Curtis promised would be approved. Rather than being an impartial regulator, it was like he was working for Purdue. It was unprecedented for an FDA official and a drug company to have this much contact, and to have a drug company literally help draft a review of their own application. That should never have happened. But not only did the FDA approve OxyContin, they allowed Purdue to claim it was not very addictive or prone to abuse. Purdue never did any actual studies on its addictiveness. They simply said because of the coating on the pill to release it slowly into the bloodstream that would prevent addiction. As a result, on the package insert for OxyContin, they added a curious line of text. Delayed absorption is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. This did not sound very scientific. It's believed by who, and based on what evidence? It was very vague, and there had never been a label like this before. But Curtis Wright from the FDA approved it, and this would become Purdue's greatest marketing tool. You see, doctors had always been very careful in prescribing opioids as their addictiveness is well established. But Purdue would use this label to tell doctors that OxyContin is basically non-addictive. The sales reps would say it's right here on the packaging and the FDA approved it. And this would be the catalyst for doctors prescribing this drug so much more. But here's where this gets fascinating. Curtis Wright soon left the FDA, and in just over a year, he got a new job working for Purdue Pharma for more than $370,000 per year. So to summarize, the FDA granted Purdue an extremely unusual label which turned out to be a lie. That label helped make the company billions, and the man who approved it went to work for that company. And sadly, things were about to get much worse. Part 4, an army of sales reps. Purdue began one of the most aggressive sales campaigns in history. Hundreds of sales reps began pitching doctors all over the country to begin prescribing OxyContin for any patients with any kind of pain. These sales reps had no medical training, but Purdue coached the salesmen to overcome any concerns from doctors. They were given sound bites to use that Purdue knew were total lies, like saying the drug could be taken for years with no risks. Purdue's boldest lie was that less than 1% of patients got addicted due to the pill's unique time-release system. Many doctors prescribed it based on this claim. However, it was later discovered that the study Purdue based this on wasn't a peer-reviewed study at all. It was a 5-sentence letter from a doctor who had done a short test using opioids in a hospital setting with a very small sample size. And it wasn't even about OxyContin. The letter was sent to a magazine in 1980. When the author of the letter found out that Purdue used this to justify the mass marketing of strong opioids, he was astounded. But tragically, it was too late. Purdue used this false claim to tell doctors there was no maximum dose of oxy since it was essentially non-addictive. Still, many doctors needed a lot of convincing. And so sales reps were instructed to essentially bribe doctors and receptionists by giving them gifts, flowers, taking them out to fancy lunches, whatever it takes. Purdue was spending millions a year just on food for doctors, so they could use that as a way in to pitch them on prescribing more of their pills, and it worked. According to Purdue's own data, physicians who attended dinners wrote more than double the number of oxy prescriptions. Since OxyContin was actually addictive, once you got a patient hooked, they would get monthly recurring prescriptions, which meant even more. Part 5, addiction sales reps started reporting back to Purdue that they were hearing concerns from doctors. Their patients were showing signs of addiction and severe withdrawal symptoms if they tried to cut down their dose. But Purdue told sales reps to stop raising issues and start selling more. One reason pain patients were getting addicted to oxy was that Podu's claim that it would provide 12-hour relief was not true. Podu's own internal documents showed that for many patients, the drug wouldn't last that long, forcing them to take more. But Podu had a plan. They started promoting a new concept called pseudo-addiction, which means if a patient looks like they're getting addicted or showing withdrawal signs, they're not really. They're just on too low of a dose, so they're still experiencing pain. So, the solution is to increase their dosage. Now, there was never any real science behind this idea, but it was perfect for Purdue. They could dismiss the evidence of people experiencing withdrawal symptoms as pseudo-addiction, who actually need more of their drug. So, Purdue started using the term pseudo-addiction in all their literature they distributed to doctors. And the person who coined this term, David Haydex, would go on to work for Purdue and become their lead spokesperson. But Purdue soon had a bigger problem. People had quickly figured out if you crushed an OxyContin pill, you could get around the time release and instead get the full dose all at once. The result was immediate euphoria with a purity similar to heroin. In fact, OxyContin became known as hillbilly heroin as it became an alternative for those looking for a heroin high, and it was easy to get since doctors have been trained to prescribe it so freely for any pain. So people would simply book appointments at different physicians across the country and stockpile pills. As a result, a black market popped up and OxyContin became the hottest street drug. More and more people were sent into a spiral of dependence and addiction. In some areas, 9% of 7th graders had tried OxyContin and 25% of 11th graders. The ease at which OxyContin was available and how easy it was to abuse also directly caused a rising crime. In regions where the drug had been most heavily prescribed, 70% of serious crime became drug-related, and there were many cases of pharmacies being robbed and all that was taken was OxyContin. A lot of pharmacies wanted to stop stocking it, but Purdue would threaten them if they did. The data was clear. Since OxyContin was introduced, there were more overdoses, more crime, and more full jails. Purdue pretended they had no idea the drug was being abused. But internal emails later revealed that all of the top PU executives and the Sacklers were very well aware their drug was widely and easily abused. In fact, they specifically told staff to delete all mentions of addiction from their communication because they wanted to hide any trace of their knowledge. One employee actually sent the Sacklers a report showing how widely abused Oxy was becoming, but she was screamed at and told to delete every copy. Instead, their plan was to blame the people getting hooked on their drug. Richard Sackler, who was president of Purdue, said in an email, "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprit and the problem. They are reckless criminals." He called them the scum of the earth. So, his plan was to portray Purdue as the victim in all of this and put all the blame on the people getting addicted. The issue with this plan was many of the people becoming addicted were legitimate pain patients who'd been using the drug exactly as prescribed. They take Oxy, but then develop a tolerance and need a higher dose. And Purdue kept telling doctors it was safe to just keep increasing the dose even though the evidence clearly showed otherwise. Seeing the damage that was unfolding, this was the moment Purdue could have put a halt to everything. But instead they doubled down. They launched a new pill with an even larger dosage, 160 mg, and continued using the same fraudulent sales techniques to push it. One lower-level PDU employee raised concerns, saying they're killing themselves with 80 mg. Why would we come out with 160 pill? The answer once again was greed. The truth was that the higher the dose, the more money the Sacklers made. The craziest part of this story is still make your own videos to come. But first, have you ever wanted to make videos like this? Here on Magnets Media, the videos are always made by humans, not AI. I write and research the videos myself. I voice the videos, and then my editors and I work together to create the video. But a huge time saver for me is using Storyblocks, who are today's sponsor. With Storyblocks, you get unlimited downloads of HD video, templates, music, sound effects, and more. And it's always content created by real artists. So, for example, if I'm looking for a certain type of song or background, Storyblocks makes it really easy to find, and I know I'll be able to monetize the video without any copyright issues. I've used Storyblocks for years, and if you're making content, I recommend you check it out. To get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/magnates or click the link in the description. Part 6. The trial. Purdue and the Sacklers were making so much money from OxyContin, they could easily afford to silence their critics and buy off the people supposed to be regulating them. For years, Purdue paid off politicians with big campaign donations, and several other officials later went to work for Purdue for huge salaries. But by 2007, the United States was in the midst of an opioid crisis. So many lives were being lost, and the CDC estimated the opioid crisis was costing the US economy $80 billion a year. So more and more people were talking about the issue. Eventually, Purdue began to come under more scrutiny. And this was largely thanks to a small group of government officials who refused to be bought off and spent years mounting a case against Purdue, showing all of the insane and manipulative tactics they had used. The evidence was overwhelming. There were graphs Purdue had manipulated to make their drug look safer than it was. There were videos of them coaching sales reps how to lie to doctors. There were doctors they paid off to do ads for them, but not disclosed that it was an ad. And so many more cases of bribery and lies. So later in 2007, Purdue Pharma was taken to trial. Even though Purdue was a private company owned by the Sacklers, the family did not attend the trial. However, several families who had been torn apart by OxyContin did. One mother said to Purdue, "You created this drug, you pushed it, you lied about it, you killed my son and so many others, and continue to do so as I speak." In the end, Purdue was convicted for misrepresenting the risk of OxyContin. They would pay $600 million in fines and admit that for years they had fraudulently marketed Oxy and deliberately hidden the drug's addiction and abuse potential, even though Purdue had known the dangers all along. 3 top executives from Purdue would also plead guilty to misdemeanors, but here's the problem. Even though $600 million is a lot, that very same year OxyContin made $3 billion. Internally at the company, the $600 million fine was viewed more like a speeding ticket. Not just that, the executives who plead guilty got no jail time, and after the trial they got back onto Purdue's private jets and received financial bonuses from the Sacklers for the pain they'd suffered. And worse still, right after the trial, Purdue just doubled down on selling the drug even more. They didn't change their aggressive sales tactics like they promised. Instead, the Sacklers voted to expand their sales force by 100 more sales reps and would go on to make many billions of dollars more from the drug. The Sacklers also voted to pay themselves hundreds of millions of dollars of dividends from the company. So, even though the trial was painted as a success by the government, true justice hadn't been done, nothing had really changed, and anyone who was paying close attention would realize an even bigger problem was just beginning. Part 7. The switch. One seemingly positive consequence of the trial against Purdue was that some doctors did begin to slow down their prescribing of opioids like OxyContin. Now that it was clear Purdue had so blatantly lied about the risks. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Millions of people had already got hooked on prescription drugs. And now that Oxy was getting harder to obtain, they found themselves turning to drugs like heroin and fentanyl instead. By suddenly shutting off people's supply once they were already addicted, they were forced to turn to the black market to escape the horrendous withdrawal symptoms. OxyContin had become the gateway to illegal drugs. In fact, Oxy had been nicknamed the heroin pill, so it only made sense that once people couldn't get Oxy prescriptions anymore, they would transition to heroin, which was cheaper. According to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, 4 out of 5 people who started using heroin around this time did so after initially starting with prescription opioids like OxyContin. Drug overdoses began to spike rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying. Purdue had done a great job of getting people on opioids, but they had no plan to get them off. Part 8. Bankrupt. Once the truth of how this opioid crisis became clear, nearly every state began suing Purdue. And in 2020, It was announced the federal government may bring federal charges. By October 2020, a gigantic $8 billion settlement was agreed. Of course, no amount of money can make up for the lives lost and the suffering of the families who lost loved ones. But this sounded like at least some kind of justice was finally going to be served. However, it turns out there was a new twist. Purdue declared bankruptcy and said there was no way it would be able to pay the fine. From the outside, this seemed impossible. Purdue had made over $35 billion from selling Oxy. How could they be bankrupt? Well, the Sacklers always knew this day may come, and so for years they had been moving billions of dollars out of Purdue and into their own personal name. They had taken more than $10 billion out of the company, eventually leaving it as an empty shell. And they'd funneled hundreds of millions to their offshore bank accounts the government couldn't touch. So bizarrely, they said the only way Purdue would be able to pay the fines for the damage OxyContin had caused would be to sell more OxyContin. Of course, this was all quite absurd. The Sacklers were saying that the company bank accounts were empty, so it couldn't pay the $8 billion fine. Meanwhile, the Sacklers who owned the company were one of the richest families in America, and they got that money from taking it out of the company over the past decade. But technically the lawsuits were against Purdue Pharma, not the Sacklers. One person involved in the case pointed out how unfair this was. They said, when your illegal marketing campaign causes a national crisis, you should not get to keep most of the money. But whether or not it was fair, the whole idea of having a corporation is that it's a separate legal entity from the individuals running it, and so they have limited liability. However, there are some exceptions, and it soon became clear to the Sacklers that if they didn't strike some kind of deal, they would face endless more lawsuits against themselves personally. So, the Sacklers negotiated a deal where they would pay around $6 billion as long as they could get full immunity so nobody could sue them again in future. This was highly unusual and the Department of Justice appealed it. So at the time of this video, it's still unclear exactly how much the Sacklers will pay. Either way, it looks like they will walk away still very wealthy, and despite owning Purdue and being aware of what was happening, the Sacklers still refused to admit any personal responsibility, even though their company pleaded guilty to felony charges. One of the Sacklers even claimed, "I have yet to see anything illegal or even immoral that this company has done." She then went on to complain how unfair it was that the lives of her children were being ruined because of all the bad press surrounding the Sackler family. The irony of one of the Sacklers talking about lives being ruined was kind of sickening. It is true that the Sackler name was forever tarnished, though. They used to have their name all over museums and colleges, but now nobody wanted to be associated with them. They had abused their wealth and power and left millions of people worse off. Since OxyContin had been introduced, overdose deaths from opioids have increased exponentially. Hundreds of thousands have died, and in America, opioids now take more lives than cars or guns. Now, to be clear, OxyContin can be a very useful drug for the people who actually need it. The problem was the Sacklers' deliberate plan to get it widely prescribed for even mild pain by using illegal tactics. That was reckless greed, and whilst many other pharma companies jumped on the trend, Purdue and the Sacklers were the ones who started it and profited most. The disturbing truth is that the opioid crisis was caused by a business seeking to profit from pain, and a single family made some of the key choices that caused so much of the opioid epidemic. If you enjoy hearing the truth behind these corporate scandals, you're going to love the insane story of why work, one of the craziest business stories ever. Just click here to watch that next, and I'll see you there.